engagement dinner and whispered, "Don't embarrass us. Just sit there, keep your mouth shut, and pretend you're just a quiet guest." She was terrified I would ruin my brother's big chance to marry into high society, especially since the bride's father was a highly decorated, no-nonsense military colonel. My family had always looked down on me, treating me like the black sheep because I didn't pursue the corporate status they worshipped. I just smiled and said, "Got it." But they had no idea who I really was. At the height of the formal dinner, the colonel suddenly stood up, walked right past my brother, and stopped dead in front of me. The room fell utterly silent as his eyes locked onto mine. What he did next made my mother's face turn completely white. My name is Kendall, and at 27 years old, I had long since accepted my role as the designated black sheep of my family. To my mother and my older brother, Austin, success was a loud, gaudy thing measured exclusively by corporate titles, country club memberships, and the manicured image you projected to society. Because I deliberately chose to keep my professional life intensely private, refusing to participate in their shallow status games, they comfortably assumed I was a complete failure, a low-level administrative disappointment barely scraping by. That illusion shattered on a Tuesday when my phone violently buzzed on my nightstand. It was a frantic 2 a.m. call from my mother, her voice tightly wound with an aggressive mixture of anxiety and social desperation. "Tomorrow night, you are joining Austin and his fiancée's family for a formal dinner," she ordered without so much as a greeting. I rubbed the sleep from my eyes, deeply confused by the sudden invitation, and calmly asked her why I was suddenly required. She snapped immediately, her tone sharp enough to cut glass. "Her father is a highly decorated military colonel, Kendall. This dinner is crucial for Austin's future status. Just sit there, keep your mouth shut, don't talk about your insignificant life, and don't embarrass us. I'm glad to have you here. Follow me so I can see how far my story has reached." The next evening, I arrived at the elite private dining room of the city's most exclusive restaurant. I had intentionally chosen a dress that was elegant but simple, completely bypassing my family's desperate attempts to micromanage my appearance. As I walked in, the air practically vibrated with tension. My mother and Austin were already aggressively brown-nosed, practically tripping over themselves to flatter my brother's fiancée, Chloe, and her wealthy mother. They were desperate to project an image of high society, and the sheer try-hard energy in the room was almost suffocating. When Austin noticed me walking toward the table, his eyes narrowed in immediate annoyance. Instead of a warm greeting, he chose to use my arrival as an opportunity to elevate his own fragile ego. He loudly and passive-aggressively minimized my entire existence to Chloe's family, introducing me with a dismissive wave of his hand. "This is my little sister, Kendall," Austin said, his voice dripping with condescension. "She just does some basic, low-level government administrative work. We try not to talk too much about it, but we're glad she could find the time to join a real celebration tonight." He smiled tightly, clearly trying to ensure I stayed firmly at the bottom of the social ladder before the guest of honor arrived. My mother nodded along with his smug introduction, shooting me a warning glare that practically screamed for me to remember my promise. I didn't say a single word to defend myself. I simply took my seat at the far end of the long mahogany table, remaining perfectly poised, quietly observing their hollow arrogance. The heavy oak door of the private dining room swung open, and Colonel Vance stepped inside, instantly shifting the entire energy of the space. He commanded absolute authority just by standing there, his posture rigid, and his eyes intensely sharp as he scanned the room. He wasn't dressed in a full uniform, but you could tell exactly who he was by the sheer, unyielding discipline he radiated. My family's eyes practically lit up with desperate ambition the exact moment they saw him cross the threshold. My mother and Austin immediately tripped over themselves trying to flatter him, leaping up from their seats with rehearsed smiles. They began laughing just a bit too loudly at his dry, introductory remarks, eagerly guiding him to the head of the table. Within minutes, Austin was aggressively bragging about his own corporate achievements, painting himself as a brilliant young executive who belonged in the colonel's elite social circle. My mother chimed in constantly, inflating every small detail of Austin's life to make our family look grand. The Colonel, however, seemed visibly drained and entirely unimpressed by their shameless sycophancy. He offered short, calculated responses, refusing to feed into their desperate need for validation. His steel-gray eyes kept moving, quietly analyzing the room with the practiced calculation of a seasoned commander. As Austin continued his loud, arrogant performance, the Colonel's gaze drifted toward the quiet end of the table where I sat. I offered him a subtle, respectful nod, watching as a faint glimmer of recognition sparked in his cold expression. The climax of the dinner arrived right as Austin stood up, raising his wine glass high to make a grandiose toast about family legacy, high standards, and the perfect blending of two elite families. He was practically beaming with unearned pride, basking in the sound of his own voice. But mid-sentence, the Colonel's eyes locked onto the far end of the table, his sharp gaze completely cutting through Austin's rehearsed, arrogant speech. Without a word, the Colonel abruptly stood up from a seat at the head of the table, completely interrupting Austin. The room went instantly quiet as he began to walk with heavy, deliberate steps down the length of the mahogany table. He walked right past his own daughter, Chloe, and right past my gasping mother, who looked terrified that something had gone terribly wrong with the evening's carefully manicured plan. The Colonel stopped dead right in front of my seat, towering over me. A warm, genuine smile suddenly cracked across his face, a complete and shocking contrast to the stone-cold, rigid demeanor he had shown to everyone else all evening. He looked down at me and said, "Hello. I'm surprised to see you here. Who are you to them?" The entire room fell utterly dead silent, the tension thick enough to suffocate. My mother stopped breathing entirely as I held the Colonel's gaze, smiled softly, and replied, "I'm his sister." The Colonel turned his sharp gaze back toward my stunned family, his voice booming with absolute authority as the shocking truth was finally revealed. "Sister?" he repeated, shaking his head in disbelief. "Well, Austin, you completely left out the most impressive part of your family legacy." He looked back at me, his smile widening. "This isn't just your sister. This is Captain Kendall, a highly accomplished officer under my direct senior command, possessing an elite record of service that I respect more than anyone else in this room." The shift in power was instantaneous and brutal. Without asking for permission, the Colonel pulled up an empty chair from across the room and sat down right next to me, completely ignoring Austin and the rest of the table. He leaned in, entirely changing his demeanor, to ask for my specific strategic insights on a recent military operation, treating me as a high-ranking equal. The shallow corporate talk that had dominated the night was instantly dead, replaced by a quiet, professional respect they couldn't even begin to understand. Meanwhile, across the table, the sheer physical panic radiating from my mother and Austin was almost tangible. My mother's face had drained of all color, her hands shaking so badly she had to set her wine glass down to avoid spilling it. They sat there in absolute, paralyzed horror as the terrifying realization sank in. They had just spent the last 24 hours aggressively ordering a superior military officer's most respected protege to keep her mouth shut and stay hidden in the shadows. The collapse of my family's manufactured arrogance was absolute. Austin tried to clumsily backtrack, his voice cracking as he attempted to laugh it off and foolishly take credit for my achievements, stammering about how they had always supported my career from a distance. But the Colonel sharply shut him down with a single, icy look, noting coldly that true honor and respect are earned through quiet service, not performed for the sake of social climbing. Chloe looked at Austin with newfound clarity and deep embarrassment, completely pulling away from him as she realized his entire family were shallow status seekers who had actively mistreated an actual high achiever. Seeing that the atmosphere was thoroughly ruined for them, I politely stood up and excused myself early. I left a massive financial and social mess for my mother and brother to clean up, with the Colonel personally standing to walk me out of the restaurant, leaving them entirely in the shadows of their own deceit. In the months following that disastrous dinner, the fallout was swift. Austin's engagement hit a massive, rocky patch from which it never recovered, as Chloe completely called off the wedding after realizing how superficial and deceitful his family truly was. My mother tried frantically to call and apologize to me, desperately hoping I would use my military connections to secure networking opportunities for Austin, but I completely blocked her number. Now, I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? This deep narrative. Make sure to check out the 2 recommended videos displayed on the final screen for other dynamic stories that are absolutely